With the help of Hashem and with tremendous joy, we are starting Masechtas Chagiga. In our order, Chagiga is the final Masechta in Seder Moed. Interestingly, as we learned in the concluding dafim of Moed Katan, we had the Tosfos that said that Moed Katan for many was the final Masechta in Seder Moed, and at first glance that would make perfect sense, because since a big part of Moed Katan spoke about the laws of mourning connected to the end of life, the Seder of Moed means a specific time, but Moed also means the cycle of life. In other words, everything that's in Seder Moed is connected to what we call now in Shulchan Aruch to the Oirach Chaim. So you have the cycle of the day, you have the cycle of the week, you have the cycle of a month, you have a cycle of a year, and ultimately you have the cycle of a life. So the concluding Moed with Moed Katan makes perfect sense. However, we will conclude the Seder of Moed with Chagiga, and that is because Chagiga deals primarily with the following two topics, with Kachim, amazing, and with Taharis. Actually, it's mamash meduyak that the Seder of Kachim begins from the beginning, as we'll speak about the Karbanos that have to be brought when the Yidden come to the Beis HaMikdash during the 3 times of the year, during the 3 Yomim Tovim, right? The 3 Regolim in the year, as we'll learn. So there's going to be a lot of dinim connected to Kachim, and then from Daf Yud Ches Amud Beis, we will be learning a lot regarding Taharas, regarding the laws of Tumah and Tara, which is a Seder that in Talmud Bavli, aside of Masechtas Nida, there is no Gemara on the Mishnayos of Seder Taharas. We will have a lot of that Gemara right over here in Chagiga. Now, concluding the Seder with Tara makes perfect sense. There is the famous teaching of Rav Pinchas ben Yoer, as it's recorded in Avodah Zarah, Daf Chaf Amud Beis, and in other places. You know, the Seder of how one thing leads to the other. So we begin with Torah, and Torah brings a person to Zehirus, that brings a person to Zerizus, and there are many steps, and ultimately leading a person to Tahara, which ultimately leads a person to Ruach HaKodesh and to Tchias HaMesim. And that's amazing. In other words, the ultimate cycle of life doesn't end with the end of life. The ultimate cycle of life ends with Kedusha, that brings to Tahara, that ultimately will bring to Ruach HaKodesh, to the return of the Beis HaMikdash, which will ultimately lead us to Tchias HaMesim, and that's the end of our cycle of Moed, Tchias HaMesim. And how beautiful is it to go from Avelus to Chagiga, to the ultimate transformation that will, God willing, happen imminently in our days. And on that note, I would like to dedicate the entire Masechta. We have here in Chabad Sol a few families that underwent tremendous loss in the recent past. So firstly, that the learning of Chagiga should be Le'ilui Nishmas Miriam Bas Moshe Bas Mordechai Moshe Aharon, Miriam Slotowitz of blessed memory. We also are going to be dedicating Masechtas Chagiga Le'ilui Nishmas Tzipoira Bas Arya Halevi Tzvika's mother. Also dedicating Masechtas Chagiga Le'ilui Nishmas Moshe Aharon ben Ezriel Halevi Shleima's father. May them, amongst all of the Jewish people, and as the Rebbe pointed out, that by the Tchias HaMesim for Tzadikim will take place immediately with the coming of Mashiach, and being that Va'amcha Kulam Tzadikim, that we should be Zoiche imminently to the coming of Mashiach, to the return of Ruach HaKodesh, to the return of the Beis HaMikdash, and that will lead us into the return of all of those that are currently temporarily resting, that they should return here Ba'olam Hazeh Agashmi, and we will have the real Chagiga, the real celebration. May that happen now. Amen. Now the Masechta, as we mentioned, will begin with Dinim of Kachim, of Karbanos, and there are generally 2 type of karbanos that every male, every zachar that's obligated to appear in the Beis HaMikdash during the 3 Regalim are obligated to bring. Now there is a mitzvah called the mitzvah of Re'iyah. Literally, the word Re'iyah means here to appear. There is a mitzvah on every male to appear in the Beis HaMikdash 3 times a year, Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot. Together with appearing in the temple courtyard, you have karbanos that we are obligated to bring. There is a karban oila known as oilas re'iyah. It's a karban that's fully burnt on the altar. We have to appear with the karban oilas re'iyah, and also we have to appear with the karban shalmei chagiga. Now, what's interesting is that a carbon shlamim is partially eaten by the kohanim and partially eaten by their owners. When the owners who bring the shalmei chagiga will eat the sacrificial meat, they're going to be fulfilling not only the mitzvah of the chagiga carbon, but they're going to be fulfilling yet another mitzvah. And that's the mitzvah of v'samachta b'chagecha. And one of the most important ways that we express or that we fulfill the mitzvah of rejoicing, of having simcha during our Yomim Tovim, is by eating sacrificial meat. Now that we don't yet have a Beis Hamikdash, pre the third temple, we also fulfill the mitzvah of simcha by eating meat, drinking wine and eating meat, even though it's chulin, because we don't yet have a Beis Hamikdash. But the ideal expression of simcha is through eating sacrificial meat. When a person ate the shalmei chagiga, they not only fulfilled the shlamim, they also fulfilled the mitzvah of simcha. But more than that, shlamim, like all of the karbanos, have a limited amount of time in which they may be eaten. Shlamim can be eaten for 2 days and 1 night. We paskin, we learned this in Beitza or in Beya. There's really a machlokes whether you can bring certain karbanos on Yom Tiv. We paskin that you can bring a chagiga and you can even bring an oila on the first day of Yom Tiv. And once you bring it, you can eat the meat once the blood is sprinkled. So for the first and the second day of Pesach and of Sukkot, it's a 7-day Yom Tiv, you have the meat of the Chagiga. From there onwards, there is still a mitzvah of V'samachta b'chagecha, which was fulfilled by bringing more karbanoi shlamim. And those karbanos were called Shalmei Simcha. So really, we bring a oilas re'iyah, a shalmei chagiga, and a shalmei simcha, but you can use the same carbon of chagiga also for the simcha as long as you have that meat. So the Mishnah, the opening of the Masechta, is speaking about the people that are exempt of appearing and coming with the karbanos, and as we will see, exactly why they are exempt. There's going to be different categories of such exemptions. We're going to be speaking about the idea of tashlumin. Tashlumin means that if a person did not bring these karbanos on their ideal day, which is on the first day of Yom Tiv, they can compensate, they can make a payment, a late payment, by bringing it throughout the next 6 days. And that's not only true regarding Pesach and Sukkot, but even Shavuos, which biblically is only a 1-day Yom Tiv, there's also the concept, as we just learned, of Tashlumin, giving us really a total of 7 days on which to bring the Karbanos, Oilas Re'iyah, and the Shalmei Chagiga, even though, again, ideally you're supposed to bring it on the first day. By Shavuos, it's on the only day of Shavuos. However, when it comes to making such payments, we will learn that there are 2 ways of viewing such a payment. One way is, as we'll speak out more when we learn the Gemara inside, that the obligation is of the first day. You didn't bring it on the first day, so you compensate by bringing it on day number 2 or on day number 3, but it's all fulfilling the obligation of day 1. Another way of viewing at the rule of Tashlumin is that if a person did not bring these sacrifices on day number 1, day number 2 brings about a new obligation. And if you bring it on day number 2, you are fulfilling the obligation of day number 2. If you don't bring it on day number 2, then there is a new obligation of day number 3. And that goes on for the 7 days. And we'll see a huge difference whether we view the compensation as a compensation of the obligation of day 1, or whether every day is, so to say, we have a new obligation if you did not fulfill it on the first day. We're going to be learning a lot about the phenomena of a Chatzi Evet Chatzi Ben Choden. There are certain people, right, if there's a person that sold himself into slavery. I'm emphasizing that because if someone was, God forbid, kidnapped and sold into slavery, then the kidnapper violated from the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not steal, and it's a capital sin, and anyone involved in that is what is completely outlawed by the Torah. This is what today's society refers to when they speak about slaves, and then finally society coming to the abolishment of slavery. But there's another type of slave, and that is when a person willingly sells himself or herself into servitude. And to a certain degree, many people that are employed doing that which they don't really love doing, why are they doing it? For the financial compensation. That's, to a certain degree, a certain type of modern slavery. I opted in, but I'm doing something that I don't enjoy doing. And there was an option in the days of old for a person to sell themselves permanently, and if a non-Jew sold himself to a Jew, that person is called a Evet Kanani. Kanani is really a name of one of the nations, but it's a code name for any non-Jew who is a slave for a Jew. An Evet Kanani must undergo, if he's a man, bris milah, must undergo, man or woman, tefillah. They go to the mikvah. They don't go to the mikvah in order to become a convert, but they go to the mikvah in order to become a Evet Kanani for a Jew. The moment they go to the mikvah, it's incumbent upon them to keep many of the mitzvahs. They are obligated to keep all of the negative mitzvahs in the Torah. However, they are generally exempt of all of the time-bound positive mitzvahs. Being that the mitzvah of appearing in the Beis HaMikdash 3 times a year and bringing karbanos is a positive time-bound mitzvah, an Evet Kanani, unless he'll become emancipated, until he'll become emancipated, is exempt thereof. Question will be, what happens if he belongs to two masters? Either two people bought him in partnership, or he sold himself to two people in partnership, or there was a person who owned an Evet Kanani and that person passed away and he left, let's say, 2 children. So each one, so to say, inherited half. And one of them freed the slave and one of them did not. So we will see how that poses a financial challenge, like to whom is he a servant? To himself or to, is he free or is he not free? He's like half free and half slave. So the financial solution is actually very simple. But we will see that as far as his getting married is concerned, he's not allowed to get married. And you can't have a scenario where there's a person that is unable legally to get married because the world was created for it to be populated. And we're going to learn many dinim regarding the Chatzi Evet, Chatzi Ben Chayrin. And on Daf Beis Amud Beis, we will learn more about one of the people that are exempt from the mitzvah of appearing in the Beis HaMikdash, known as a Cheiresh. That's Ches Reish Shin. Cheiresh means a deaf mute, and we will actually see that there is a deaf mute, a bona fide Cheiresh, which in the times of Chazal, because of them being unable to communicate, and no one communicated to them in the days of old, they did not mentally develop, they became mentally underdeveloped, and therefore they were exempt of all of the commandments, including the mitzvah of Re'iyah. And then we will learn about a minimum Cheiresh or a partial Cheiresh, as we'll learn, someone who only cannot hear, sometimes someone who only cannot speak, which is also called a ilim, a mute, could be called a Cheiresh, and we'll see how, as far as are they also exempt or partially exempt from all of the mitzvahs, or partially exempt from the mitzvahs of Re'iyah, as we will develop the sugya on Daf Beis Amud Beis. Without any further ado, let us begin our new Masechta. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam shehakol niyeh b'dvarim. Says the Mishnah, Hakol chayavim b're'iyah, that all men, all Jewish men are obligated in the mitzvah of Re'iyah, of appearing. Says Ardashi, this is referring to the mitzvah. Top Rashi in the Amid, b'mitzvahs re'iyas kol zechurcha. When it says in Parshas Mishpatim, shalish b'amam b'shana yeirah kol zechurcha, all of the men should appear. That is what the Mishnah is talking about. Tosfos says that the Mishnah cannot only be talking about the mitzvah of appearing, because as we will see soon mentioned in our Mishnah, many details regarding the sacrifices that are brought when one appears. So therefore, the Rabbeinu Tam, I'm scooting down to the middle of Tosfos, says that our Mishnah is also speaking about Karban Re'iyah, means Oilas Re'iyah. And it doesn't only mean the Karban Oilas Re'iyah, it also means the Karban Shalmei Chagiga as well. It means both. And appearing in the Azara. And actually, the Rabbeinu Tam says that that's really what Rashi means. Rashi didn't mean to exclude from our Mishnah the reference towards sacrifices. Our Mishnah is speaking about both, that everyone is obligated to appear and not to appear empty-handed, but yes, to come with, at least on the first day, with these two types of sacrifices, one known as a Oilas Re'iyah and the other as a Shalmei Chagiga. Now, Mishnah gives exceptions. Chutz, who's exempt from this obligation? So first we're going to group 3 together, Cheiresh, Shoita, V'Katan. A Cheiresh, we'll see, means deaf mute. We'll speak on Amud Beis how many halachic poskim hold that nowadays, being that we learned how to both communicate to them and we teach them how to communicate with us, that many opinions in halacha hold that today a deaf mute is not exempt from any mitzvah. He's a bona fide, developed person who is obligated like any other yid in all of the mitzvahs. In the times of Chazal, however, the deaf mute was mentally underdeveloped. So a chedesh, like also a person who's halachically deranged, a shaita, will have on Daf Gimel Amud Beis the definitions of a shaita. And or a minor, any person who's under bar mitzvah is considered someone who's not yet developed, fully mentally developed. They are really exempt from all of the commandments, including this one. Now, line number 2, another type of exemption is that the Torah writes explicitly that this is a mitzvah incumbent upon Zecharim, Yeiroi Kol Zechurcha, men, not women. Now, what about a tumtum? A tumtum is someone who is either male or female, but we don't know what gender they belong to because there is a skin, there is a membrane that's covering over their genitalia, and that is a person that's called a tumtum. So the tumtum is really either a man or a woman. We don't know. Again, today with modern medicine, today it's easy probably to remove that membrane, and regardless, you can take an X-ray and find out what gender they belong to. In the times of Chazal, we didn't know. That's a tumtum. An androgynous is someone who's born with physically both the genitalia of a man and of a woman. So our Mishnah holds that a tumtum and an androgynous, and nashim and women, and avodim she'eino mishachranim, and slaves that are not emancipated. This is an evet kanani that's not emancipated. Yes, obligated to keep the negative commandments, but as a rule, not obligated to keep the time-bound positive commandments. Chagiga, someone who's lame, v'hasuma, someone who's blind, and now hachayla, someone who's ill, Ma'azak, and someone who is old, umisha eina yachala alois beraglo, for anyone who, because of any type of physical infirmity, is unable to walk with his feet from Yerushalayim to Harabayis. And as we will learn, the Torah also refers to the holidays as shalosh regalim. Regalim, feet, legs, yeah, because the final ascent to the temple has to be done physically, walking on your own 2 feet. And even though this is a very external physical infirmity, doesn't matter. That person is biblically exempt of appearing. Exempt doesn't mean that they cannot appear. No, they can show up. It just means they're not obligated to show up. And the story that the Alter Rebbe had a chassid that would always visit him, and there are many who actually say that halachically, even when the temple is not yet standing, the mitzvah of appearing when there's no temple means to appear for your Rebbe, to go to the Rebbe for Yom Tov. And he would walk to the Rebbe, he would walk from his village to, whether it was in Liozna or later in Liadi. And when he became very old and he was unable to walk, so Hasidim offered to give him a ride on their carriage. So this Chassid said that he doesn't want to go. If he's unable to walk on his own 2 feet, he doesn't want to go. And this Chassid felt that the mitzvah of his life was the mitzvah of spending Yom Tov with the Rebbe. He says, imagine how it will be that in the next world, when they come to acknowledge my mitzvah, a horse will stand next to me, because the horse is the one that also helped me get there. I don't want a horse as a partner in this mitzvah. Dafke beraglayim. Okay, ezeu katan. Now, what's the definition of a minor? The Mishnah is really asking, even though we know that prior to bar mitzvah, you're not obligated to keep the mitzvahs, but there is a mitzvah of chinuch. Very important Rashi in our Mishnah that says that the mitzvah of chinuch is on the father and on the mother. So from when do we have the mitzvah mitzat chinuch, which is a rabbinic mitzvah, if you want to get technical? The mitzvah of educating our children biblically is to teach them Torah. Vishinamtam levanecha. And really the way the Rebbe says, the general concept of chinuch is for sure a biblical concept, because how can God command me as a bar mitzvah to do the mitzvahs if I wasn't previously trained? But there are many specific details about chinuch that we say this is a detailed mitzvah midrabanan, but it's only from a certain age. You know, there's a katan and there's taf. There is a boy and there is an infant. So an infant doesn't yet have the mitzvah of chinuch, not even midrabanan. So says our Mishnah, Izeu Katan, from what age are you old enough that now the father and the mother are obligated mitzvah chinuch to take you to the Azara for Yom Tov? Really, this will be done by the father, because the mother herself is not obligated. But again, Rashi, when he speaks here about the mitzvah of chinuch, Hitilu chachamim al aviv ve'al imoy lechanchoy b'mitzvahs. So here we have our first machlekes b'shamay beis Hillel. Says the first opinion, says Beis Shammai, kol she'eino yachol lirkav al kseifav shel aviv. if the child is that young that he's even not able to ride on his father's shoulders to go up from Yerushalayim to the Har HaBayis, that is the minor that is exempt, even midrabanan. There isn't even the mitzvah of chinuch. These are the words of Beis Shammai. Once the child is old enough, he cannot walk by himself, but he can ride on his father's shoulders, then midrabanan, because of chinuch, the father should take him with him. However, Beis Hillel Oimrim, no, that's still too young. If the child cannot walk, not by himself, but at least holding on to his father's hand, even though he's old enough to ride on the father's shoulders, since he cannot walk, even with the holding on to his father's hand, he is exempt. There isn't even a mitzvah of chinuch. It's Beis Hillel's age of being mechanech, a minor, for the mitzvah of re'iyah is a bit later, is when the child is a bit older. And it makes a lot of sense, because what's chinuch? Chinuch is to educate a child now, so when he or she becomes bar or bas mitzvah, they should be familiar with keeping that mitzvah. Being that the mitzvah is walking from Yerushalayim to Har HaBayis, Beis Hillel argues if the child is not actually walking, so that's not the chinuch. Riding on the shoulder is not something that the child will do when he will become obligated. So what point is there training the child now doing that which will never become a mitzvah for the child? Shenemar, and how do we know that the inyan is dafka to walk? The Mishnah says, because it says, Shalosh Rigalim. This is machlokes number 1, and soon we will share a phenomenal insight from the Rebbe, Likutei Sichos Chelik Tezayin, Truma is Dalid, that makes Azal Lishitosoi from all of the Beis Shammai and the Beis Hillels, and we're going to link this machlokes with the next machlokes, as we'll speak out in a moment. Argument number 2. And like the Rabbeinu Tam pointed out, that even Rashi, who emphasized the mitzvah re'iyah of appearing, and there is a mitzvah to appear, to show up, but it's also referring to showing up, and not empty-handed, but with, like we mentioned, oilas re'iyah, shalmei chagiga. Now, many karbanis don't have a minimum amount of value that you have to spend in order for you to fulfill the obligation. If the animal meets all of the halachic criteriums, that it's not halachically blemished, that it's the right age, sometimes it has to be the right gender, then you got yourself a carbon. But there are some karbanos that at least midrabanan, the sages said, it has to have a minimum value. So here we're going to have a very interesting machlokes Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel as to what is the minimum value of the oila versus the chagiga, which one has to have a higher value. Let's read it inside. Beis Shammai yoimrim hare'iyah, which means a carbon oilas re'iyah midrabanan, has to have the value of at least 2 kesef. The word kesef is referring to a silver ma'ah, mem ayin hey. Just to know, 1 ma'ah is a 1/6 of a dinar. In other words, 2 kesef means 1/3 of a dinar. The chagiga, the shlamim, could have a lesser value. There is still a minimum value, midrabanan, but that's only 1 ma'ah. In other words, according to Beis Shammai, the oila has to have a greater value. Beis Hillel oimrim mamash the opposite. Hare'iyah has to have 1 ma'ah of kesef. The chagiga has to have 2 ma'ah of kesef. Now the Rebbe in the Sicha that we just quoted, Tezayin, Truma, Dalid, on page 318, that Sicha is really a Sicha making a siyum on Chagiga, but the Rebbe, as the Rebbe often did, connected the ending to the beginning. Maskifin ashlamta la'aschalta. And so we're not going to speak about the siyum, but we'll speak about this argument. And the general approach that Rebbe shares is that everything has the way it is in its potential, and then the way it is in its developed form. Beis Shammai celebrates things as they are in their potential. They're more potent, but they're less developed. Beis Hillel celebrates and marks and focuses on something that's more developed. So, for example, let's go into the latter machlokes. A carbon chagiga is not only eaten on the altar, achilas govoya, but it's also later consumed by the kohanim and by the owners. And the Chazal many times refer to all of the karbanos in the category of shlamim as an animal that has 2 achilas, there are 2 consumers. It's more developed. Oila is exclusively to God. So one would argue that if you're looking at the way the carbon is manifesting, that which is consumed by more consumers should be larger. Normally should be more valuable, which is exactly what Beis Hillel holds, that the chagiga should have double the value of an oila. Beis Shammai looks the opposite way. All of the consumers, all of the details of the carbon come from one nekuda, and that is that we are offering a carbon to God. That is really the essence of it. We are getting close to God. We are doing an action for God. It's expressed, whether it's expressed by only God eating it, by God eating it, and other people eating it. These are details. Actually, a carbon that's only consumed on the altar is expressing its root more than the shlamim, because once things begin to develop, many times you're going away from its core. But if you never went away from the core, which is a carbon is to get close to God and to bring the world close to God, and it's very focused, there's only one consumption, God, the altar, so you see in its expression, you see more its root, its ikir. So Beis Shammai holds, Adarabba, that the oil should have a greater value, because that's really, the oil is where we find the expression of what it really is in potential more than in the shlamim. And the same thing is when it comes to education. The poil mamish, in actuality, before a child can walk, argues Beis Hillel, then what's the point of being machanech the child? Because ultimately the mitzvah is to walk biraglayim. As we'll learn many details, if a person is lame, they are exempt. If a person, God forbid, is an amputee, they are exempt. But Beis Shammai holds, you're right. You're right that a child, like an adult, the mitzvah is to walk. But once a child is riding on the father's shoulders, potentially he's about to be able to walk. In potentially someone who theoretically can already walk. It's not yet manifest. But since that ability is already there in potential, according to Beis Shammai, he's already obligated in the mitzvah of chinuch. And let's start reading the Gemara. Now there's a general rule when the Mishnah uses the words all are obligated, hakoil, the word all, it's coming to include something beyond of what you think. So the Gemara asks, hakoil, all, lasuye mai, what is that including? What person is a person that you might think is not obligated, but the Mishnah is emphasizing now all are obligated, even that person. Approach number one, says the Gemara, lasuye misha chetzi eved v'chetzi ben chayrin, like we spoke out in the intro, if a person is half free and half slave. So you would think that since a eved is exempt, he's half eved, he also should be exempt. So the Mishnah is saying, no, only if you are a full eved, if you are half free, you are already obligated. Says the Gemara, hold on. If that is the meaning of hakoil, then it won't fit according to Ravina. Ravina the Amr, and we're going to learn Ravina on Daf Dalet. And Ravina says explicitly, Misha Chetzyoy Eved v'Chetzi ben Chayrim, that person is exempt from Re'iyah. So hakoil lasuye mai? So the Gemara answers, lasuye chiger b'yom rishon. What happens if a person on the first day of Yom Tov was lame? The Mishnah told us that a lame person, unable to walk, is exempt from the mitzvah of Re'iyah. But then nispashet b'yom sheni, but on the second day or on the third day, this person healed and now they are able to walk. So comes the Mishnah and says, that person on the second day, now that you can walk, now bring appear with the karbanis. Again, the Gemara challenges that answer. Well, that's really subject to the argument that we spoke about in the intro. When we gave the two options, whether it's all tashluman derishon, or whether every day there is a new obligation that is born on every day since you didn't bring on the day prior, the big difference between these two approaches will be our case. If all of the days are viewed as compensation payment for the first day's obligation, if someone is exempted on the first day, for example, because they are lame, even if later they are healed, doesn't matter. They will never be obligated. You can walk on day number 2. So what? The karbanos of day number 2 are really a fulfillment of the obligation of day number 1. If on day number 1 I was exempt, I remain continuously exempt. The only reason to say that if someone healed throughout Yom Tov, now they are obligated to bring the karbanos, is because we're going to view the concept of payment, tashlumin, not as payment for day number 1. If the karbanis were not brought on day number 1, on day number 2, there is a new obligation. If there's a new obligation on day number 2, if there is a new obligation on day number 3, and today a person is not lame, indeed they are obligated. A similar thing you're going to find what happens to someone who becomes bar mitzvah during the 7 days. Same concept. What's if it's all tashlumin zelozeh, every day is a new obligation because you did not bring it previously, then you'll be obligated to bring the karbanos now that you became bar mitzvah on the 3rd day of Sukkot. If it's all tashlum and derishin, I don't care that you became bar mitzvah in the middle of Yom Tov. It's payment for the first day's obligation. If you are exempt the first day, you will never become obligated during this Yom Tov. So, according to that opinion, indeed, you will not be obligated. So again, hakol, the word all are included. All have to bring lasuye mai answers the Gemara la asuye suma ba'achas me'enom. That comes to teach you that if someone is blind, God forbid, in one eye, even though the Mishnah mentioned the blind being exempted from re'iyah, what happens if you are only blind in one eye? And this is actually subject to a machlokes tanoim. Udaloika haytana. If our Mishnah means to hint with the word hakoil that if a person is, God forbid, blind but only in one eye, they are obligated, then our Mishnah will not be a unanimous Mishnah. It would only follow those who don't agree with Rabbi Yochanan ben the Havai. As we learned in Abraisa, Yochanan ben the Havai says in the name of Rabbi Yehuda that Suma, even only ba'achas me'enav, is already patur min ha're'iyah. Now why would that be? Because it says in Parshas Mishpatim, when the Torah says that 3 times a year, Yeira'eh, Kol zechurcha, all of the menfold. Yeira'eh. Now the word Yeira'eh means one should be seen. The word Yira means one should see. Really what that means, so first of all, when we read the Torah, we have the mikra, the pronunciation. The Torah has no vowels. So how do we pronounce the words? Yira or Yeira, when you look inside the Chumash, the letters are the same. Yud Reish Aleph Hey. We know that the mikra, the way you pronounce these letters here, is Yeira'ah, that shall be seen. You should appear to be seen by God. But there's still the way the word could be read, or the way the word is written allows itself to be read, Yira. And it's amazing that the oral Torah many times, regardless to which way of pronouncing is considered the most important way, aim la mikra, aim la mesoidus. We'll unpackage that another time, but that's a theme throughout Shas. We compare one to the other. So Yira, Yeira, since these letters could be read 2 ways, learns from that Yochanan ben the Havai in the name of Rabbi Yehuda, Kederech, just like Shebalira is just like he comes to see. Now this actually, according to Rashi, is going to God. Just like God also comes to the Beis HaMikdash to see those who came. Kach ba'leirois, God comes to be seen, which means that there is a revelation of godliness in the Beis HaMikdash, and God wants us to see that. But the fact that we are putting together in the same word, simply depending on how you read it, God seeing and God being seen. Now, of course, no one sees God. God is unseeable, but godliness, God's might, God's power, God's glory is seeable. But we are comparing one to the others to teach us that Ma'alira is just like when God sees. Kaviyachal, God sees with 2 eyes. Of course, God forbid, has no physical form at all. But the godliness, at least from the world of Atzilus downwards, Adam, Kitzalmenu bidmosenu, Adam ha'elyon, there is the concept of 2 eyes. We know what the right eye, the positive eye, the tolerant eye, the left eye, looking at things judgmentally. Life needs to have both. These are the 2 divine eyes. So just like God sees with both eyes, af leira'os, when we are coming to see godliness, who is obligated? Only one who has 2 eyes. So according to this understanding, suma ba'achas me'enov is exempt. However, we are saying that the word hakoil is arguing with this opinion, and if someone is taka blind with both eyes, they are exempt from re'iyah. But if a person is blind in only one eye, then according to this understanding, according to our Tana, not like Rabbi Yehuda, you'll be chayiv. The Iboy Sema says the Gemara that la'olam kedo amri meikara. I'm going to tell you that hakoil comes to include a chatzi evet, chatzi ben choyden. Yes, is obligated in the mitzvah of re'iyah. You have to appear and you have to bring the korbanos. As we'll learn on Daf Dalid, I will give you a phenomenal answer like Hashem. Kan on Daf Dalid k'mishnah rishayna. That was based on the first opinion of Beis Hillel, but after a while, as we'll speak out in a moment, Beis Hillel acquiesced to Beis Shammai. It's amazing that once a Tana held an opinion and it was incorporated in the oral Torah, even if they changed their minds, we never stopped repeating their original idea. Mishnah loizazim im kaima. So Daf Daled is based on the original opinion of Beis Hillel. Kan, here on Daf Beis, even according to Ravina, after Beis Hillel agreed to Beis Shammai, Kemishna Achroina, like his latter and final opinion, that a Chatzi Eved, Chatzi Ben Choden, according to all, are Chayiv in the Iyah. Now, what are we talking about? So let's go to Tanan. Here we go. Mi Shechetzi Eved v'Chatzi Ben Choden. So, a person bought an Eved, a person sold himself as an Eved, and the owner owned him, and that person passed away. The owner passed away. So the contract of Avdus, the understanding is that they will now become the Eved of the heirs of their master. If the master left more than one, let's say he had two sons, so now the Eved belongs to two. One of them wrote a document of emancipation. So now this person is half free man, half slave. So here we go. As far as the financial understanding, that's a simple thing to resolve. So one day he works for himself, one day he works for his master. However, these are the words of Beis Hillel, and everything is perfect. Comes along Beis Shammai, turning to that Beis Amid Beis, that the Kantem Es Rabba, you remedied the financial challenge. It works out great for the master who every other day has a Eved, but as far as his personal life is concerned, as far as the main part of life is concerned, which is marriage, family, this person has no remedy. Lisa Shifcha, for him to marry a Shifcha Kananis, which is just like there's an Eved Kanani, there's a Shifcha Kananis, a woman who sold herself into slavery. If she was not born Jewish, even though she went to the mikvah l'shem Abdus, she's not a bona fide Jew. An Eved Kanani can marry a Shifcha Kananis, but this person may not. Since once an Eved Kanani is emancipated, he or she becomes a full-fledged Jew or Jewess. We're focusing here on the man, on the Eved, so he can't marry a Shifcha because he's half Bas Choden, and a Yachal. To marry a Bas Choden, he can't because he's half Eved. Can't marry anyone. Tosfos brings out the question, well, why can this person not marry a woman who was a Shifcha, who became half freed? Tosfos says it wouldn't work. So libatel, to have this person not be married, that's unacceptable. The world was created in order for it to become populated, as it says, and now we're quoting a pasuk in Yeshaya, the world was not created for it to be desolate, only, yes, it was created lisheves yitzara, for it to be habitated, for it to be settled with people. 8 billion people, 16 billion people, as many people as the world will have, that's exactly what God wants. God wants a world that's filled with people. Now, just to point out that many people, when they speak about the mitzvah of Piri V'Yirivya, they quote the pasuk in Genesis, Pru'uravu. Why doesn't Chazal quote Pru'uravu? So from the many approaches, Pru'uravu is a mitzvah on the person. The person has to attempt to have children. If a person got married and they were not granted the gift of children, they were oiskin bePru'uravu. They tried. Even more than that, if a person is dating, and God forbid the person cannot find his shidduch, he can also, I was trying to get married. Pru'uravu is a mitzvah that's not result oriented. It's about you doing your part. This pasuk of Yeshaya is result oriented. The world has to be populated. In other words, you can't say, well, the person would have wanted to get married, but the halacha does not allow him, so he's an oinus, doesn't help. Certainly not for the l'sheves yitzara. You have to populate the world. So therefore, Beis Shammai argued, and we'll see Beis Hillel later agreed, Ela mipnei tikkun ha'olam, to have a world that functions, which is a world that is filled with people, koifen es rabba, you force the master that owns half of this person, and that person should give him a document of emancipation for the half, and therefore he'll become a full-fledged ben choden. Now normally you free a slave if someone pays for it. So in our case, we're not expecting for him to have the money because he's still a half slave. So he writes an IOU document, so that was the machlokes. Originally, Beis Hillel held that you don't force the master to free. During that time, Beis Hillel held that such a person is exempt of going to the Beis Hamikdash. But since at a certain point later, he agreed to Beis Shammai, so now we have the following concept, and I'm going back on that Beis Amud Aleph in the end, the last line in Rashi. Once Beis Hillel holds that halachically the master has to free this Chatzi Evet Chatzi Ben Choden, even prior to him freeing the half, halacha looks at him as if he's already freed. And since we view him as someone who's already freed, now even Beis Hillel will be moida that he's obligated in the mitzvah of Re'iyah like any other full-fledged, free Jewish man. Gewaldik. Okay, continuing in the Gemara on Daf Beis Amud Beis, referring back to the Mishnah that says, Chutz Mechede Shoita V'Katan, these are three that the Mishnah bunches together, that they are all exempted of keeping this mitzvah, really all mitzvahs, because they are not mentally fully capable, right? So says the Gemara, since they are all equated together, Katani Chedesh Dumad Shoita V'Katan. The word Chedesh, again, the word Chedesh sometimes can only mean someone who's deaf. Actually, in even lesser amount of times, but still sometimes Chedesh can refer to someone who's only mute. Our Mishnah must be referring to the deaf mute, because only then is this person completely equated to the Shaita and the Katan, just like a Shaita. A person who's deranged, not mentally competent. A Katan is not yet developed. Katan, their issue. And the reason why they are exempt is because the Lav B'nei Deya, because they're not mentally fully there. Af Chedesh of our Mishnah must be referring to the Lav B'nei Deya. And therefore, by the fact that the Mishnah groups them all together, the Mishnah, by implication, the Komash Malon, something that is written explicitly in Mishnayos and Terumos. There, the Mishnah writes, Chedesh dibru chachamim b'kol makom. That whenever the sages speak about this Chedesh that's exempt from all the mitzvahs, it's only referring to someone who has both handicaps. Not the person can hear, nor the person can speak. Which really means that if a person is able to speak, he only cannot hear. Or if the person can hear, but he can't speak, then the person will be obligated. Now again, just to speak out, we spoke this out on the intro, that many poskim, not in the 21st century, but going back 200 years and closer, the Beis Shlomo, the Divrei Chaim, the Maharsham, they already held that as we figured out how to communicate to a deaf mute, and how to teach the deaf mute to communicate to us, they no longer have a status of someone who's not fully mentally developed, and they are bona fide Jewish adults. So just to make that point. But now we're going back to the times of Chazal, and we should just know that the more isolated the person is, the less they mentally developed. Interaction with others is something so foundational to human and to mental and to emotional development. So now the Gemara says that so this implied din of our Mishnah, and the one side that's explicit in Terumos is even furtherly verbalized explicitly in the following Braisa, where the Braisa writes, Hamadaber ve'eino shemeya, someone who speaks but cannot hear, that could be referred to as a Chedesh. Not of our Mishnah, not of the Mishnah of Terumos. Someone who can hear but he cannot speak is referred to as a ilaim, as a mute. And I want you to know that sometimes, even this person, someone who can hear but cannot speak, is also referred to as a Chedesh. In other words, there are two types of Chedesh. There is a full-fledged Chedesh, deaf mute, our topic, our Mishnah, and then you have like a minimal Chedesh. And v'zeh, both of the latter cases, only deaf or only mute, they are like intelligent, developed people that are obligated in all of the mitzvahs. Okay, now the Gemara just wants to know, like if we're using the word Chedesh, even for someone who is minimally handicapped in that area, why do we dafka use Chedesh more often for someone who speaks and cannot hear? And why is it for someone who can hear but cannot speak is referred to almost always as a ilaim? So first of all, that's because that's the way Scripture refers to them. And now we're quoting a pasuk in Tehillim Dechsev as it says, "V'anike Chedesh loy eshma." You see, Chedesh loy eshma only. Uche'ilaim, which is loy yiftach piv, gavaldik. That the word ilaim is a composite of the Aramaic a way of referring to someone who cannot speak. Someone who was mute is called in Aramish someone that ishtakel milulei, whose speech was taken away. Ishtakel milulei. Now you should know that when it comes to words, that are comprised of many letters. If you want to know which letter is the most important letter, or which letters are the most important letters, first letter is the most important, second important is the last letter, and then everything else is like the milui. So if you look at the word ishtakel in Aramaic, which means to remove, to take away, ishtakel begins with an aleph and ends with a lamed. That's aleph lamed. The next word milule begins with a mem. That's elaim. Elaim is a composite of ishtakel milule. Says in the Mishnah, Truma is going back. Madaber v'ena shemeya. Shemeya v'ena madaber. I'm sorry. It says in the Braisa that we just quoted, you're chayiv. And we got a problem. We got a big problem. Problem is, we learned in the Braisa regarding our mitzvah, our topic re'iyah, appearing in the temple with sacrifices on the 3 Yomim Tovim. It says clearly, if someone is medaber, but v'ena shemeya, right, the minimal chedesh, they can't hear. Or if someone can hear, but they can't speak, generally referred to as an elaim. Again, sometimes referred to also as a chedesh. The Mishnah, the Braisa writes, patur, oy gewalt, they are exempt. Our Mishnah seems to imply that only if you are deaf-mute. Now we're saying that even if it's only one part is not functioning, you are exempt. So answers the Gemara, Amar Ravina. Other people say the answer was shared by Rava. Chasure, Mechsere, V'hachi Kitani. The Mishnah really has to have some extra words added to it. It's not pshat that those words were written by Rebbe and then they were lost. No, it means that we have to learn into the Mishnah the following. Hakol chayavim b're'iyah. Everyone is obligated in the mitzvah of re'iyah, and now this elaborated version is going to add en simcha. Simcha is that we spoke about, like the third carbon shalmei simcha. Chutz mechedesh hamadav ve'ena shemeya. If someone is only a minimal chedesh, which is either, again, he speaks but can't hear, or he can hear but he can't speak. I know it's a elam, but here it's also a chedesh. Such a person is already exempted from the oila. Pater min hara'iyah. But he's not pater from the chagiga. But the afal pisha pater min hara'iyah, he's chayiv in the simcha. And by the way, Tosfos, the second to last line, writes, including chagiga. So you have a minimal exemption, and then it's as if the Mishnah writes further, but if you have a full-fledged chedesh, like the cotton, like the minor, they are completely underdeveloped, then they are pater even from simcha. And that's because since bechlal the chedesh, the real chedesh, deaf mute, shoyte v'katan are exempt from all commandments, so they're going to be exempt also from the mitzvah of re'iyah. You know, before we go, in next daf, we're going to have a scriptural source for this. But conceptually, it's a beautiful thing. In other words, simcha should not come only when everything is perfect. If something is functioning, be b'simcha. Now, Tanya Nami Hachi, that which we are saying is, so to say, in between the lines in the Mishnah, is explicitly written out. Everyone is chayiv and iyan simcha. That's how you begin. Now, let's begin with a small exemption. Chutz mechedesh hamadaber ve'ena shemeya, and the chedesh that shemeya ve'ena madaber. And here again, normally it's called an elaim, but this is also included in this chedesh. They are partially exempted. And again, in next daf, we're going to learn a source. Why do we say they are exempted from re'iyah and not from the simcha? But they are exempt from re'iyah. However, turning to daf gimel, they're chayv b'simcha. And now there's another din. There is a full-fledged chedesh. That, like shoita, like a cotton, are completely exempt. The and the shoita and a cotton, they are paturim af min simcha. Hoyelu paturim mikol mitzvahs ho amurais batoira. God willing, to be continued.